In 1685, King Charles II of England collapsed at 9 o'clock in the morning while being shaved by his barber. What followed over the next 4 days is one of the most thoroughly documented medical events in 17th century history. And it reads, by modern standards, less like a medical intervention and more like a carefully choreographed attempt to kill a man who might otherwise have survived. In the first hour, 14 ounces of blood were removed from his neck by incision, then an emetic to induce vomiting, then a purgative, then a second purgative, then blistering agents applied to the shaved scalp to draw humors to the surface, then a sneezing powder to purge the brain, then more bleeding, then more purging. Charles II died on the 4th day. His physicians expressed satisfaction at the comprehensiveness of the treatment they had provided. This was the best medical care available to the most powerful man in England. Before this story is over, you will understand how surgery, the most technically demanding practice in the entire history of medicine, spent over 1,000 years in the hands of men whose primary professional qualification was the ability to cut hair. And how the transition from barber to surgeon was not a clean march toward progress. It was a revolution paid for in blood, most of it the patient's. To understand how surgery ended up in the hands of barbers, you have to understand the decree that put it there. In 1163, Pope Alexander III issued a ruling at the Council of Tours that would shape Western medicine for 3 centuries. Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine, the Church abhors blood. The decree prohibited clergy, who at this point constituted the majority of educated medical practitioners in Western Europe, from performing any procedure involving the cutting of human flesh. Bloodletting, incision, amputation, all of it forbidden. The reasoning was theological. Blood was sacred. Shedding it contaminated the spiritual purity of a man in religious orders. The consequence was not that surgery stopped. People continued to need wounds treated, arrows removed, limbs amputated. The need did not disappear because the church found it inconvenient. Surgery was simply handed down. From the educated physician, who read Galen in Latin, theorized about the humors, and would not soil his hands with a scalpel, to the man already holding a blade, the barber. Barbers in the medieval period were already the most widely available practitioners of minor physical procedures in European society. They bled patients by opening veins with lancets, they pulled teeth, they lanced abscesses, they dressed wounds, they amputated fingers, they also cut hair and shaved faces. All of this, same shop, sometimes same appointment. The striped pole still marking barbershops today, red for blood, white for bandages wrapped around the pole to dry after use, is not a decorative tradition. It is a medical relic. A 400-year-old advertisement for a surgical practice still visible on every high street in the world. The barber surgeon was not a figure of incompetence. This is the part of the story almost always told wrong. The best barber surgeons of the 15th and 16th centuries were, within the constraints of what was known, extraordinarily skilled. They worked without anesthetic, without antiseptic, without any understanding of germ theory, and within those constraints, they developed techniques of speed and precision that shaped surgical practice for centuries. Amputation, the most common major procedure of the pre-modern era, was performed by a skilled barber surgeon in under 3 minutes from incision to tied stump. 3 minutes. No anesthetic. Patient fully conscious. Not because speed was preferred, because speed was the only anesthetic available. Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French barber surgeon, now considered a founding figure of modern surgery, developed techniques that saved thousands of lives not through formal medical education, which he never received, but through accumulated experience across 3 decades of battlefield surgery. During one particularly large battle, he ran out of boiling oil, the standard treatment for gunshot wounds, and improvised with a mixture of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. The patients treated with the improvised mixture survived at dramatically higher rates than those treated with boiling oil the day before. He did not know why. He recorded what he observed. He changed his practice. In doing so, he established, in the middle of a 16th century battlefield, with a barber's training and a surgeon's eye, one of the foundational principles of evidence-based medicine. When asked how he had saved a particularly hopeless patient, Paré replied, "Je le pensais, Dieu le guérit." I dressed his wounds, God healed him. But the barber surgeon's world had a ceiling, and that ceiling was made of the thing that killed more surgical patients than any individual mistake, any botched amputation, any misdiagnosis: infection. In the great teaching hospitals of early 19th century Europe, surgical ward mortality from post-operative infection ran between 25 and 75%. Between 1 in 4 and 3 in 4 surgical patients died. Not from the surgery, from what happened afterward. The surgeons of this era did not wash their hands between patients, did not sterilize their instruments, wore the same coat, increasingly stained with dried blood from previous operations, as a badge of professional experience. They called it good old surgical stink. They considered it a mark of distinction. Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrated in 1847 that mortality in hospital wards dropped from 10% to 1% when physicians washed their hands with chlorinated lime solution between patients. His colleagues refused to believe him. He was dismissed, professionally ostracized, eventually committed to a mental institution where he died in 1865, 2 years before Joseph Lister published the antiseptic surgical technique that proved him correct. The man who discovered how to stop surgical patients dying of infection died in an asylum, unbelieved, while the hospitals that dismissed him continued killing patients at the same rate. Lister's antiseptic revolution, published in 1867, based on Pasteur's germ theory and Lister's application of carbolic acid to wounds, instruments, and operating theater air, did not immediately transform surgical practice. It was resisted. Beneath the scientific objections was something more uncomfortable. The implication that surgeons themselves, with their unwashed hands and blood-stained coats, had been killing their own patients for decades without knowing it. That is not an easy thing to accept about oneself. It took 20 years, from 1867 to the late 1880s, for the revolution to complete itself. And in those 20 years, with the evidence publicly available and the mechanism understood, surgical wards continued killing patients at the old rates. 20 years. Known cause, known solution, continued deaths. That gap between understanding a problem and implementing the solution is not a failure unique to Victorian medicine. It is the most human failure there is. Today, a surgical team preparing for an operation scrubs for a minimum of 5 minutes with antimicrobial soap. Every instrument is sterilized to a standard that eliminates all viable microorganisms. The operating theater air is filtered and pressurized. A sterile field is established and maintained throughout the procedure. All of this exists because of what happened in the centuries before it was understood to be necessary. The red and white pole still spins outside the barbershop on the corner. Most people who walk past it have no idea what it means. It means that the man inside once did what the surgeon does now, with a basin, a blade, a leather strap for the patient to bite, and no understanding of the invisible world that was killing everyone he was trying to save. Charles II, bled and purged and blistered across 4 days by 14 physicians who documented everything and expressed satisfaction at the outcome. He did not die because his doctors were malicious. He did not die because they were incompetent by the standards of their era. He died because the standards of their era were not enough. The patient on an operating table today is the beneficiary of every death that happened before the knowledge caught up to the need. The striped pole is not a relic. It is a reminder of how long it took, of what it cost, of how many people paid the price of a world doing its absolute best and getting it catastrophically, lethally, consistently wrong, and of how recently, how very recently, the best finally became good enough to matter.